if one would engage in a kind of parlor room area studies and break up the world into different regions, component parts, and the importance of each as in its role in defining the U.S.'s self-image, I think Latin America plays a particularly important role. East Asia would be seen as an area of potential economic and military competition. Africa as a basket case, often a place that tests and often chastises our will to do moral good in the world. The Middle East as the staging ground for this epic clash of civilizations that we all know about. Latin America, I think, is portrayed, or to the degree that it is discussed at all, and at least at the beginning of the War on Terror, as a success story. Confronted in the post-World War II period with insurgent states, ideologies, political movements, mobilized nations, mobilized ideologies, Washington responded with an effective mix of hard and soft power, neutralized the opposition, and helped transform most of the continent's nations into free market allies and its citizens into willing consumers of U.S. goods and technologies. Central America, particularly in the 1980s, with the U.S.-supported death squad counterinsurgencies in El Salvador and Guatemala, and anti-communist revolutionaries, the Contras in Nicaragua, I think proved a particularly important role in consolidating what we know now as a conservative interpretation of foreign policy. And I think the reason why Central America was so important is that it corresponded, it was contemporaneous with the larger success of the Cold War, U.S. victory in the Cold War. It fused the kind of regional success of unalloyed hard power in Central America and moral justification of using that hard power with the larger victory of the U.S. in the Cold War, which, truth be told, took place within the confines of the old New Deal framework: negotiation, compromise, patience. That is all the things the neocons hated about Ronald Reagan's stance toward the Soviet Union. But no matter, the death squads and the New Right insurgents did successfully retain Central America within U.S. influence at the cost of 300,000 lives, and neocons unzipped that success to extrapolate on the larger Cold War as a whole. This, I think, explains the kind of compulsive references to Central America, particularly to El Salvador, to justify unilateralism and war. Bill Kristol described Reagan's Central American policy as, quote, an amazing success story despite the qualms and objections of the left and liberals. And he did so in order to justify Iraq. Dick Cheney, in his 2004 debate with John Edwards, vice presidential debate, when asked what he had hoped to accomplish in Iraq, pointed not to post-war Japan or post-war Germany, the kind of metaphors or analogies that we're all used to, but to El Salvador of all places. The examples go on. Latin America, in other words, is good for telling stories that the U.S. likes to tell about itself, and it continues to be so. The repeated equations, for example, of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela with Adolf Hitler follows a long line of using the World War II metaphor to make sense of third world nationalists, ever since the Dulles brothers followed Anthony Eden in describing Egypt's Nasser as Hitler on the Nile. In 2006, thanks to WikiLeaks, we know this, U.S. Ambassador to Bolivia, David Greenlee, invoked the French Revolution to describe the rise of current President Evo Morales, giving a short lecture or tutorial to George Bush's Department of State on who exactly the Jacobins were. Quote, the Jacobins and Robespierre, he spells Jacobins right, but he got Robespierre wrong. Two B's. He did that repeatedly through the cable. Were notorious for their reign of terror. They arrested and executed political adversaries and allies alike, and ultimately met their demise from the same instrument used to execute the opposition, the guillotine. To extend the analogy, this is Greenlee going on, many pundits have argued that Morales, Evo Morales, may meet his own demise at the hands of protesters. Reading Greenlee's tutorial put me in mind of another U.S. ambassador in another Latin American hotspot during another politically fraught moment, and that was Edward Corey, who served as U.S. ambassador in Chile between 1967 and 1971. He greeted Salvador Allende's 1970 election as if the sans-culottes were at the gate. Before, memo after memo, they're actually quite lyrical, some of these memos. Before all cables back to Washington, before all the votes were in, he smelled, quote, the stink of defeat and could hear the mounting roar of the Yandistas acclaiming their victories arising from the street below. No guillotine blade had yet dropped, but material declassified from the United States State Department over the past couple of years showed that Corey fired cable after cable back to Washington, warning of the terror to come, dismissing his popular unity coalition as a troop of fools and knaves, leading Chile to the Marxist slaughterhouse. He cited Baudelaire to brand Allende a devil. Now, it may seem strange that an LBJ-appointed Democrat would pepper his diplomatic cables with the overheated prose of French Romanticism. And the point that I'd like to make here is not the obvious, that oftentimes historical analogies darken rather than lighten, and they blind U.S. policymakers and opinion makers like Corey to the contours of and consequences of actually existing history. In this case, it wasn't Allende that was leading people to the slaughterhouse, but U.S.-backed opponents of Allende that would institute a reign of terror. But rather, I'd like to use my remaining time to talk about how it is that Latin America can so seamlessly be fitted into these shape-shifting analogies that even though they moved from Jacobins to Nazis to the Soviet Union, I think share a fundamentally coherent understanding of the world. And for analogies to make sense, they have to take root within a certain kind of political and intellectual environment. When scholars consider U.S.-Latin American relations,